Top of the morning to you. So, you want to solder some copper pipe together, eh? Well, let's see if we can get you helped out. There are a few key ingredients to soldering that make it successful. One is you got to have the right solder. For copper pipe, there are two kinds you could use. You could use solid solder, which nowadays is probably the majority of is tin, a little bit of copper, and I believe I'm going to use older lead-based solder and go, oh God, the world isn't going to come to an end. If you do this right, it isn't a problem. Whatever you do, avoid any solder that's intended for sheet metal work or metal work, like gutters and stuff. That solder has acid in it, and you don't want the acid. You want either solid core solder, or solder with a flux core or rosin core. You can do either of those. Okie dokie. So now you got your solder. You want a source of heat. I'm going to use this propane torch. Depending on what you're doing, you could also use MAP gas. MAP gas burns a little hotter. There are other torches that use acetylene and air. Those are hotter yet. If you're just doing a brand new installation, propane's probably fine. If you're doing something where you're doing a repair and there might be water in the line, you might have a little problem because you can't get the line hot enough because the water keeps wicking the heat away, and you might need MAP gas. Okay, one of the things you're going to need to do is get the end prepped. Let's just say we're going to solder this pipe onto this little splice sleeve. One of the first things you're going to do is clean the inside of this thing. It ought to be pretty clean. This little wire brush would work. I kind of like steel wool. A lot of guys like heavy sandpaper. It's kind of your own. Whatever you do, get it clean and get it wiped off, and it ought to be bright and shiny. Do the same to the outside. This tool is made for 1/2-inch copper pipe, and you just rotate it around on there. And let me look at something. Yeah, and it also has a handy-dandy inside part too. One of the things you need to do before you if you cut this with a tubing cutter, make sure you use the deburring tool or a pocket knife to go around the inside and remove that burr in there. The burr won't hurt anything, but it will help slow your water flow down a little bit. This ought to be pretty shiny. You can use sandpaper. Like I said, I like steel wool. It's cheap and it does work. Make sure that burr is removed. You can use solder with flux in it, or you can take a little bit of flux. I just put a little bit on my finger there and just dab it on there and roll it around in there. Try not to get it too far down, just keep it where the joint's going to be. The joint is, on this piece, has a little line there, so it'll stay inside of there. And make sure when you go to assemble this that you mate the two sides that you just cleaned. If you clean this side and you get it flipped over and do the other side, you're going to have trouble. So go ahead and mate them together and make sure that that goes all the way in. I usually twist it a little bit, help spread the flux around. Okie dokie. This could be up in the air. We're just kind of messing with it out here in the open. One of the other things you need to do too is before you take off or run in here is you might need a small wet rag. If you're doing this up in a ceiling in your basement or someplace where there might be some rafters or something, you might want to put up a barrier to keep from burning the ceiling. Nothing says I'm not a professional like a burn ceiling joist after you've spent an hour trying to burn some soldering iron together or some pipe together. They make these little pads that reflect the heat. I don't know, you can do whatever you want. What I do is I use sheet steel, and I bend it around and then I clamp it or tack nail it with a couple nails, and that makes a heck of a good reflector too, and it helps kind of reflect the heat back toward the thing. The pads work too. They're kind of well, they used to be asbestos. I don't know what they're made out of now. Okay, so we'll see if we can. This will actually happen pretty quick, and I'm going to try and do this. Let's see here. I'm going to try and hold this. and get it centered in the camera. And okie dokie, so we're going to warm this up, and basically what you're going to do is you're going to put the solder right here at the mating surface of these two. The capillary action from the metals should pull that in there. Now there are a couple different schools of thought. A lot of guys just kind of feed it at one place. It should go around. Some people like to slowly move it around. Some guys take a heavy mitt, you know, like, and after you've got that solder in there, they give it a little twist. My suggestion is you go get some old crap pieces of pipe, and what you're looking for is, it should be a fitting like that, or a solder job like that, where it should be inside. You don't want to get too much in there. I suggest you get a few solder fittings and try this yourself, just out here in the open like I'm doing. It'll give you an idea, and you can peek in the end and see what's happening. You don't want to get too much solder in there, whether it be lead based or the newer leadless based. You want just enough to keep it together. So we're going to go ahead and solder this. This happens pretty quickly on new stuff. One of the things I try and resist doing is dropping my tools. I try not to just heat the joint directly, because all that's going to happen is you're going to oxidize it. The heat from the torch will burn the fitting, and it will take away the brightness. One of the things you want to watch too is if you get too much flux on there, the flux will clean an area, and as you solder it may run that way. So if you get too much flux on there, it'll drip and make a big mess. Again, practice is your ally here. Okie dokie, that didn't take too long. One of the things you can do is when you get done, you can take a wet rag and kind of lightly wipe that off a little bit. If you look in the end here, you can just barely see the solder starting to well up around there. After a while, you'll get a feel for how much solder goes in there. This solder is pretty skinny, so there's going to be a lot. If the solder was thicker, it wouldn't take as much because there's more material there. And it's not too, and don't forget to go on to the next fitting, you'll need to clean this end again. Hopefully my head wasn't in the way too much. And you can see there's just a small little, what do I say, area of solder around there. That's, and here's my thumb. You can see how small that shiny area is. And don't forget this is hot. You might want to, have some gloves. It's cooling off pretty quick though. On this piece here, this is an old one that somebody's removed. Man, this is some heavy wool, and you can see that it's pretty well soldered all the way around. There's a little piece there. A really good way to find out is to take and heat that up and wipe it off. One of the things that'll help you too is let your torch warm up a little bit before you start waving it around. See, that piece was really well soldered, and you can see that it's not too bad. Now it looks like the person had a little flux run over here, but that's no big deal. It's pretty decent. I'd say that's a top-notch job. They didn't trim the burr off. No big deal. Learning how to solder with these little pieces of leftover junk is really great. And it cools off relatively quickly. If you use a wet towel, don't solder this and then splash it on there. It's pretty good. The real way to find out whether this is well, you can pour the coals to it, or throw some water in the pipe. Or a good way to find out how your soldering is done is after you do this is to take it apart. But I would bet that more than likely that's in pretty good shape. Like I said, on the inside, you can just barely, you got to really stare at it, barely see. This joint probably could use a little bit more. If you look at it here, it could, there's no, what they call a fillet, there's no little curvature there, but it's probably just fine. And these fittings are relatively inexpensive. Actually, a good place to obtain some fittings, if they'll let you, is a salvage yard. Some salvage yards won't resell items to the public, which is kind of dumb. It's what they're there for. I don't know if you can see inside of here, it's oxidized a tiny bit, but not bad. And then you can take some, if there's a little bit of flux left, take some alcohol or something and wipe that off. Or if you use, some of the fluxes are water-based actually, and you can clean that right off there with that. Yeah, it's in pretty good shape. So there you go. It doesn't take a lot. Practice. Practice is your friend. That pipe doesn't fit as well as the other one did. There really isn't a need to tin the ends. This would technically be tinning. I don't think that's really necessary. You can do this like this. To be real honest, I used to do that way when I was very first trying to learn how to solder pipe, and it's kind of a waste of time. And believe it or not, you can solder fittings, upside down like that. If you get the heat back here, if the heat comes from this direction, when I heated the pipe, you notice I didn't heat that directly. I kind of kept it moving. It tends to oxidize the pipe less. If you keep the heat back here a little bit and let it warm these things, it'll have a tendency to draw the solder. The solder will act more like kind of like water and has a capillary action. It'll pull that up in there. especially if you have fittings like this. You know, a lot of guys, they keep filling it till it runs out. I don't know. That works and it doesn't. I've seen before where the flux will run down inside there and then the solder will fill the pipe. This way works fine. There are probably hundreds of, you know, how to sweat solder pipe together on YouTube. Mine is just one more. Probably the only difference is I'm probably one of the few, if any, that's going to tell you practice this first. If you really want to learn how to do it, practice, or find a friend that's a plumber. Because since they do that every day, they can help you, and they probably will want to. You know, a lot of people in the trades like to see people learn things instead of relying on them. That being said, a couple little warnings. Now again, try not to overheat stuff. If you're soldering like a valve or a faucet head or something like that, it's a good practice to open it a little bit and take the rubber away from the seat. A lot of times I'll disassemble it, like on a ball valve or something like that. They're tough to do if you're not careful with the heat. But make sure you open the valve a little bit. That way the metal contacting the rubber O-ring or the rubber seat won't burn it. That's a little, I guess, a pro tip. Okie dokie. Well, if you have any questions, I don't think you should. You should be okay. If you have a question or comment, feel free to leave it. Also, feel free to join my channel or subscribe, whatever you like. I don't just solder. This was a spur of the moment thing. I just had this out here, and I've had some requests. And to be real honest, it's such a basic process. I've really tried to kind of avoid it. It's kind of a learned thing, I think, a lot. I really think if you want to know how to solder, you just try, and as long as you know the basics, you'll be okay. Anyway, have a groovy day. Take it easy.